Paris, 1947. The world was still bleeding from the wounds of war. The streets smelled of ash, of fear, of an uncertain future. And suddenly, on a brightly lit runway, a feminine silhouette appeared like a miracle. A wide skirt, a cinched waist, gentle shoulders. It was the rebirth of beauty, the return of desire, the resurrection of hope. The press baptized it with two words that would never be forgotten: the new look. No, but behind that splendor stood an enigmatic man, Christian Dior. Painfully shy, deeply superstitious, obsessed with flowers and astrology. In barely 10 years, he built an empire that conquered Paris, New York, and Tokyo. And yet, his life ended as abruptly as his rise had been dazzling. This is the story of a creator who transformed femininity into a weapon of power, who turned fashion into a religion, and who paid the highest price for having touched eternity. Christian Dior was born on January 21, 1905, in Granville, a small seaside town in Normandy, facing the fierce waters of the English Channel. His family was well off. His father, Maurice Dior, ran a prosperous fertilizer business. His mother, Madeleine, was an elegant woman who filled the house with fresh flowers and delicate perfumes. A childhood seemed wrapped in velvet, surrounded by gardens and strolls along the sea. Yet, in the heart of the boy, a different sensitivity was already germinating, an observant eye that saw everything as if it were a blank canvas. Christian spent hours in the garden, caressing the petals of roses as though they held secrets. He studied how the light changed their colors depending on the hour of the day. This fascination with nuances, with the silent harmony of nature, would become the foundation of his entire aesthetic vision. His mother taught him that elegance was not ostentation but proportion, delicacy, and invisible balance, and Dior absorbed that lesson as if it were a sacred commandment. At school, however, he did not shine. He was timid, fragile, unable to assert himself in the noisy games of other children. What he held dear were his secret notebooks, filled with sketches of hats and dresses, always with meticulous strokes, as though he feared the world might steal those images from him. From an early age, Dior discovered that drawing was his refuge, the way to capture beauty before it vanished. But there was another, darker influence shaping his life: his obsession with the occult. Family members recalled how Madeleine would take her children to visit fortune tellers, how Christian became fascinated with tarot cards and prophecies. That mix of luminous gardens and shadowy omens would mark his personality forever. A man who, even at the peak of fame, would not take a step without consulting the stars. That fragile boy from Granville could never have imagined that one day, from his hands, a style would be born that would restore hope to a weary world. For now, he was only a small dreamer, learning in silence to listen to the secret language of flowers and of beauty. When Christian Dior left behind the salty breeze of Granville and his mother's gardens to settle in Paris, destiny seemed to open a luminous path before him. But the City of Light, in the era of 1920, was itself a stage of contradictions. Artistic splendor and economic fragility, endless parties and lengthening shadows. Dior arrived with the dream of becoming an architect of beauty, not through dresses, but through art. With his family's support, he opened an art gallery with a friend. It was not just any gallery. Its walls bore works by Picasso, Dali, and Braque, while young surrealists wandered through, champagne in hand, debating the future of art in fevered tones. Dior did not paint, but he could choose. His eye was intuitive, almost prophetic, capable of detecting what tomorrow would celebrate. His gallery became a small epicenter of the avant-garde, a meeting ground where aristocrats, collectors, and bohemians crossed paths. Yet that dream was destined for a bitter end. In 1929, the Great Depression struck with ruthless force. The global economy collapsed, and with it, the Dior fortune. Maurice, His father lost the family business. Christian watched as the gallery he had built with such enthusiasm crumbled overnight. The walls that once held the dreams of modern art stood empty. Suddenly, Dior was ruined, adrift, stripped of identity. The Paris that had welcomed him as an elegant young dandy now saw just another man struggling to survive. For years, he drifted between temporary jobs, surviving only through the generosity of friends. Tuberculosis weakened his body. The ruin of his family crushed his spirit. It was a dark decade marked by illness, uncertainty, and the humiliation of having no place in the world. And yet, from those ashes, a new vocation emerged. To earn a few coins, Dior began selling sketches of hats and dresses to fashion houses. What had begun as a childhood pastime suddenly became a lifeline. In the lines of his drawings, he rediscovered order, proportion, hope. Paris, the same city that had broken him, would become the laboratory where Dior began to forge the visual language that would one day change history. Amid that darkness, one certainty remained a light. Art could fail, fortune could vanish, but beauty always survived. The destiny of Christian Dior shifted in the era of 1940, when his sketches began to circulate through the most respected ateliers of Paris. Those fine, elegant lines, balanced yet filled with fantasy, caught the attention of key figures in haute couture. Little by little, Dior went from selling drawings in dim cafes to being hired as an anonymous designer within some of the most influential fashion houses. It was there that fate led him to the atelier of Lucien Lelong, one of the indispensable names in Parisian fashion of the era. Working at Lelong was not a luxury, it was a school. There, Dior crossed paths with another young talent who would also change fashion history, Pierre Balmain. Together, as disciplined apprentices, they became architects of elegance under the strict but visionary eye of Lelong. Nazi-occupied Paris was a city of contradictions. On one side, it endured deprivation, humiliation, and fear. On the other, fashion persisted as both a cultural act of resistance and a business that somehow had to survive. In that precarious context, Dior designed dresses that found their way into the wardrobes of both the wives of German officers and the women of French high society. It was a dangerous balance, morally unbearable at times. Yet Lelong, like many others, believed that keeping fashion alive meant keeping the spirit of France alive. If we close our houses, he would say, Paris will cease to be the capital of elegance, and that would mean surrendering victory. Dior, timid and reserved, understood the logic. Fashion was far more than fabric and seams. It was a symbolic weapon, a cry of national identity. The years at Lelong gave Dior what his life until then had lacked: discipline, structure, and a profound understanding of the machinery that powered haute couture. He learned to navigate demanding clients, to transform sketches into living garments, to manage workshops, and to think not only of beauty but of business. That apprenticeship would prove vital when his moment arrived. But something deeper was already germinating within him. While Paris bore the scars of war, Dior envisioned a rebirth. In his mind danced new silhouettes, cinched waists, abundant skirts that defied austerity and sorrow. In the midst of occupation, he dreamed of flowers. While others designed to survive, Dior was already planning how to return to the world the luxury of dreaming. When the war finally ended, France was exhausted, starving for bread and starving for hope. And Dior, who had endured ruin, illness, and humiliation, was, for the first time, fully prepared to offer the light everyone was waiting for. His meeting with Marcel Boussac, the textile magnate who would become his financier, was about to lift the curtain on a new chapter: the birth of the House of Dior. February 12, 1947. Inside the elegant headquarters on Avenue Montaigne in Paris, the world of fashion witnessed a silent earthquake. It was the debut collection of the newly founded Maison Dior, backed by textile magnate Marcel Boussac. The air was thick with anticipation, but no one could have imagined that this runway would change history forever. The models began to walk, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Dresses with voluminous skirts that bloomed like flowers in full explosion, impossibly narrow waists that sculpted the silhouette, soft and rounded shoulders. It was the absolute antithesis of wartime fashion, the fashion of rationing, of reduced fabrics, of harsh lines born from scarcity. What Dior unveiled was a return to luxury, to opulence, to femininity elevated into spectacle. Carmel Snow, editor of Harper's Bazaar, wasted no time in giving it a name. It's such a new look, 2 words that instantly became legend. In a Paris still scarred by ruins, Dior offered a rebirth. It was as if the women who had survived the war suddenly reclaimed their right to dream, to seduce, to desire. The impact was immediate and polarizing. High society clients rushed to place orders, enthralled by a silhouette that made them feel like queens. But protests rose as well. Feminists and working-class women denounced the vast skirts, yards and yards of fabric as an insult in a world where bread was still scarce. In the United States, demonstrators accused Dior of pushing women back into decorative roles. Yet the controversy only magnified his fame. Dior had grasped something essential. After devastation, the world did not crave more austerity, it craved an excess of life. His dresses were portable gardens, dreamlike architectures that returned to women the power of being admired. With a single show, Christian Dior transformed from an unknown into the crowned king of fashion. The new look was not merely a trend, it was a cultural manifesto. It embodied France's resilience, the return of Paris as the capital of elegance, and the promise that beauty could rise again from the rubble. And in that moment, Christian Dior did more than launch a fashion house. He built an empire. After the explosion of the new look, Christian Dior became a global phenomenon. The Maison Dior, born almost out of nothing, in a matter of months transformed into a synonym for luxury, power, and desire. Paris reclaimed its throne as the capital of fashion, and Dior stood as the banner of that cultural resurrection. The success was so overwhelming that Dior grasped something crucial. Fashion could no longer be confined to a single exclusive atelier in Paris. It had to expand as a global brand. With the backing of Marcel Boussac, he launched a growth plan unprecedented in its scale. In 1947 itself, he created Parfums Christian Dior, inaugurated with the now iconic fragrance Miss Dior, a tribute to his sister Catherine, who had survived the Nazi concentration camps. That floral, elegant scent was more than a perfume, it was a symbol of resistance and hope. Soon after, Dior opened boutiques in New York, London, and later Caracas, Tokyo, and Sydney. The name Dior began appearing in shop windows across the world. Haute couture, once a sacred art reserved only for the Parisian elite, became an international phenomenon. Hollywood stars from Marlene Dietrich to Rita Hayworth wore his gowns like unwitting ambassadors of this new empire. Dior understood better than anyone the power of diversification. While other houses focused solely on exclusive dresses, he expanded horizons, perfumes, accessories, gloves, handbags, even hats. Maison Dior was no longer just a fashion house, it was an entire universe of style. Every creation carried his unmistakable aesthetic, elegance, femininity, and a luxury that seemed unattainable yet endlessly aspirational. The strategy worked like a spell. Within only a few years, more than half of France's fashion exports bore the Dior label. By the close of 1940, it was estimated that 7 out of every 10 women who dreamed of haute couture dreamed of Dior. In less than a decade, his name had become a synonym for global aspiration. But behind this breathtaking rise was a crushing weight on Dior's shoulders. He was a shy, reserved man who preferred gardens over parties, fortune tellers' cards over banquets. Yet he now found himself at the eye of a hurricane of fame, travel, interviews, and responsibilities. He had built an empire, yes, but also a gilded prison from which he could never fully escape. Dior's expansion was not only commercial, it was almost spiritual. He had managed to reconcile a war-torn world with beauty. His dresses traveled beyond fabric. They became proof that hope could be sewn, embroidered, and worn. In just 5 years, Christian Dior had ceased to be a mere couturier. He had become a living myth. Behind the spotlights, the magazine covers, and the endless applause, Christian Dior remained a man of surprising fragility. Those who knew him closely spoke of a disconcerting duality. On the runway, he was a king. In private, he was shy, insecure, almost superstitious. Dior never fit the image of the flamboyant designer who thrived on attention in the Paris salons. He did not drink excessively, nor did he indulge in endless parties or media scandals. His true pleasure lay in gardens among roses and lilacs, in the silence of green spaces where he found refuge. There, far from the flashbulbs, he regained his strength. Yet he lived haunted by destiny. From a young age, he had cultivated an almost irrational fascination with astrology, tarot, and omens. Before unveiling a collection, he never hesitated to consult fortune tellers, searching in cards and stars for confirmation that success would be at his side. Many in his circle mocked this credulity, but for Dior it was not a whim. It was a way of exerting control, however symbolic, over a world he always felt was on the verge of collapse. In his personal life, Dior was guarded to the extreme. He kept his private affairs far from the press and rarely spoke of his relationships. Rumors of his homosexuality circulated discreetly in Parisian salons, but he never confirmed them openly. He preferred to maintain an aura of mystery, knowing that any revelation could be used as a weapon against him in a still conservative society. That tension between private truth and public mask accompanied him to the end. As his empire grew, so too did the pressure. Dior found himself trapped in an exhausting cycle. Each season had to outshine the last. Each show had to be a global event. His name had become larger than himself. That paradox, being adored worldwide, yet feeling imprisoned by his own legend, wore him down, little by little. Those who worked by his side described him as a kind man, but marked by melancholy. He smiled rarely, spoke softly, and avoided the spotlight whenever he could. His strength did not come from explosive charisma, but from an unshakable inner vision. In his fragility lay a strange greatness, the ability to listen to silence and transform it into beauty. Such was Christian Dior, the man, a timid gardener of forms, a superstitious soul who trusted in the stars, a creator who never fully believed himself worthy of the crown Paris had placed upon his head. And yet, it was precisely this mixture of vulnerability and genius that made him unforgettable. October 23rd, 1957, the world of fashion came to a halt. Christian Dior, the man who had returned hope to millions of women with his new look, died unexpectedly in Montecatini, Italy. He was only 52 years old. The news struck like lightning across Paris, New York, Rome, Tokyo. The press spoke of nothing else. The king of fashion had vanished at the very height of his empire. The circumstances of his death were shrouded in mystery. Officially, it was said he suffered a heart attack while on vacation on the Italian coast. Some claimed the attack was triggered by an overly rich meal. Others, more malicious, whispered of excesses, of reckless physical exertion, of a destiny sealed by his own obsessions. The myth fed on contradictory versions, as if reality itself could not accept that such a powerful man could vanish in so banal a way. Inside the salons of Avenue Montaigne, seamstresses wept in silence. Workshops that had once thrummed with discipline and creativity now felt like mausoleums of fabric and thread. The Dior empire, which in barely a decade had conquered the world, suddenly stood without its architect, without the compass that had guided it. Paris, still proud of its crown as the capital of elegance, now feared the crown might fall. The most tragic irony was that Dior had just begun to dream of retreat. In letters to close friends, he confessed a longing to leave behind the crushing pressure of fashion, to retire to a garden, to cultivate roses, to reclaim the silence that fame had stolen from him. The shy man who had built a colossal empire wanted, at heart, to return to the boy of Granville who once listened to the secret language of flowers. Death robbed him of that final chance for peace. The cultural impact was immense. In the days that followed, thousands of women around the world sent letters of condolence, recalling how a Dior dress had changed their lives, how it had restored their confidence in themselves. Journalists agreed. With the death of Christian Dior, an era had ended, but his name was already etched into eternity. In just 10 short years, this fragile man had raised a cathedral of beauty that not even his absence could bring down. The myth had only just begun. The sudden death of Christian Dior left behind a void almost impossible to fill. The empire he had built in barely a decade needed a new voice, someone capable of keeping the flame alive without betraying the spirit of its founder. Paris held its breath. Who would be chosen? The answer stunned everyone. Shortly before his death, Dior had named an unexpected successor, a young man of just 21, shy, slender, with oversized glasses and nervous manners. His name was Yves Saint Laurent. To many, it seemed a reckless gamble, even an act of madness. How could a boy, practically unknown, carry on his shoulders the weight of the most influential maison in the world? Saint Laurent had arrived at Dior in 1955 as an assistant, recommended by Michel de Brunhoff, the director of Vogue Paris. From the very first day, Christian had seen in him something rare, a gift. His sketches revealed a piercing sensitivity, an innate grasp of proportion, and a daring spirit that reminded Dior of his own youth. Superstitious as always, Dior confided to close friends that he sensed this young man was destined for great things. When it was officially announced that Yves Saint Laurent would become artistic director, the international press reacted with skepticism. Many predicted collapse. But the true test came in 1958, when Saint Laurent unveiled his first collection for the Maison, the now legendary trapeze line. The show was a triumph. Models walked in dresses that abandoned the tightly cinched waist in favor of freer, lighter, more fluid silhouettes. It was a break from the new look, but not a betrayal. It was evolution. The audience, which had arrived with fear, rose to its feet in applause. Yves Saint Laurent had achieved the unthinkable. He had proven that Dior could survive without Dior. Yet for the young designer, the weight was immense. Every creation was compared to the master's work, every decision examined under a microscope. He lived caught between two imperatives: loyalty to Christian's legacy and the urgency of stamping his own vision. That tension would mark his entire career, but it would also propel him to become one of the greatest names in 20th century fashion. The arrival of Yves Saint Laurent at Dior not only saved the Maison at a moment of crisis, it opened the door to a new generation of designers, proving that fashion was a living art capable of reinventing itself even after tragedy. Dior was gone, but his legacy transformed, like a seed bearing fruit in another body, another voice, another vision. The Maison had survived its most brutal blow, the death of its founder and the uncertainty of an unexpected successor. Thanks to the precocious genius of Yves Saint Laurent, Dior not only remained standing, it continued to shine. Yet the story of Dior after Dior was never a straight line, but a succession of reinventions that, each in their own way, kept the flame of the empire alive. After Saint Laurent's forced departure in 1960, drafted into military service, and ultimately replaced by corporate decision, the Maison entrusted its destiny to Marc Bohan. His style was more classic, more restrained, less daring than Yves, but that very sobriety provided stability. For more than 2 decades, Bohan consolidated Dior as a house of elegance and consistency, cherished by loyal clients such as Grace Kelly and Elizabeth Taylor. It was a period of continuity, a breath of calm after storms. In the era of 1980, a seismic shift arrived with Gianfranco Ferré, the Italian architect of fashion. His structured, monumental collections restored to Dior an air of grandeur, almost sculptural. Ferré knew how to reinterpret the legacy of the new look through a contemporary lens, reaffirming the idea that Dior was more than a name. It was a concept capable of adapting to every era. But the true earthquake came in 1996, when John Galliano took the creative helm. The British designer transformed Dior into a theatrical spectacle. His shows were visual operas, overflowing with excess, drama, and fantasy. Galliano turned the Maison into a laboratory of extravagance, carrying the brand to a new generation and making it a symbol of audacity. Though his personal scandals brought his tenure to an abrupt end in 2011, no one could deny that he had reignited the myth with an uncontrollable fire. Afterward, Raf Simons assumed leadership in 2012, bringing back sobriety and purity of line, reinterpreting femininity with poetic minimalism. His brief tenure left a mark for the delicacy with which he dialogued with Dior's heritage. Finally, in 2016, the Maison appointed Maria Grazia Chiuri, the first woman ever to direct Dior. Her arrival marked a historic shift. Dior was no longer only the house of idealized femininity, but also of empowered womanhood. Chiuri transformed the runway into a feminist manifesto, with embroidered messages like, "We should all be feminists," showing that Dior's legacy could be not only aesthetic, but political. Thus, Dior after Dior was never a mausoleum frozen in the memory of a dead genius, but a living organism capable of reinventing itself with each generation. Each creative director, with their unique vision, added a chapter to the legend, proving that the name Dior had transcended the man to become an immortal institution. The name Christian Dior did not remain tethered to the era of 1940, nor confined to the memory of a genius who died too soon. His impact transcended fashion to become a cultural and social phenomenon that defined the 20th century and continues to influence the 21st. To speak of Dior is to speak of the transformation of femininity, the reconstruction of collective identity, and the consolidation of Paris as the eternal capital of elegance. With a new look, Dior didn't just change women's silhouettes, he changed the way they inhabited the world. After the war, many women had assumed roles in work and society that had previously been denied to them. The practical austerity of wartime fashion had erased any excess. Dior restored desire and sensuality, but in a way that went beyond aesthetics. He proposed that women had the right to dress, not only to survive, but to dream. That gesture was a cultural act of power, though also one of controversy. Some saw it as regression, others as revolution. Over the decades, the Maison Dior emerged as a social barometer. In the era of 1960 and the dawn of 1970, it adapted its message to a world in the throes of youth-driven upheaval. In the era of 1980, it reflected the rise of opulence and economic power. And in the 21st century, under Maria Grazia Chiuri, it embraced feminism, turning the runway into a political platform. At every stage, Dior reflected the tensions and aspirations of its time. The cultural impact of Dior also spread through cinema, music, and the visual arts. From Marlene Dietrich to Natalie Portman, from Edith Piaf to Rihanna, generations of artists wore Dior not merely as fashion, but as symbol. A Dior gown was never just fabric, it was a manifesto of identity, a universal language of glamour and power. Socially, Dior came to represent the democratization of luxury. Though haute couture remained an exclusive realm, The expansion into perfumes, accessories, and pret-a-porter lines allowed millions of women and men across continents to access a fragment of the Dior dream. A bottle of Miss Dior or a Lady Dior handbag was not just an object, they were amulets, tokens of belonging to a global community of desire. Beyond the catwalks, Dior became a metaphor for something essential: humanity's ability to reinvent itself after devastation. France emerged from World War II in ruins, but the triumph of Dior symbolized the resilience of a nation reclaiming its pride. Every stitch from his atelier was, in a sense, a thread sewing together the wounds of an entire country. Today, Dior is not merely a fashion house. It is a cultural myth, a reference point that bridges past and present, capable of inspiring emerging designers as well as activists who see fashion as a tool of expression. The legacy of Christian Dior does not rest in a museum. It lives on in the way we continue to understand beauty, power, and femininity. Christian Dior lived barely 52 years, helmed his maison for only a decade, and yet left a mark that seems to stretch beyond time itself. His life was brief, like a sudden flame, but his work became an eternal fire. From a timid child wandering the gardens of Granville to a visionary who transformed the scars of post-war pain into beauty, his story proves that even fragility can give birth to greatness. The new look was never just a fashion, it was a rebirth. Where Europe saw ruins, Dior planted flowers. Where women had been reduced to uniforms of survival, he restored to them the magic of feeling desired, powerful, visible. With each collection, he was not merely designing dresses, he was writing chapters of hope. His sudden death, at the height of glory, sealed the legend. Dior remained in memory like those rare geniuses who depart too soon, leaving behind an aura of mystery. But his empire did not falter. On the contrary, it expanded, transformed, and endured across generations, as if the very name Dior had detached itself from the man to become an archetype of universal elegance. Today, when we speak the word Dior, we are not only speaking of a brand, but of a cultural language. It is the perfume that evokes resilience, the dress that empowers, the runway that mirrors the history of women across the 20th and 21st centuries. Dior is proof that fashion can be more than ornament. It can be identity, memory, even redemption. The eternity of Dior does not lie in fabrics that fade with the years, but in the echo he left in the way we understand beauty. For as long as there is someone who slips into a dress with a desire to feel alive, Christian Dior will still be there stitching, silently, from immortality.